David Mandel is the director and an executive producer of House Plumbers on HBO. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. David, considering your background showrunning Veep and writing political sketches all those years ago, I feel like this is the absolute perfect project for you. How long have you been wanting to do a Watergate series?
You know, it's funny. I didn't think anyone would ever do a Watergate series, so I never thought to ask to do a Watergate series. So what was very funny was one day I found out there was a Watergate series, and the next thing I knew, I was the director of it. So it kind of worked out pretty perfectly. But God bless HBO. I don't know what to say except only they would make this show about two very dangerous guys in the 1970s who went to work for the president to basically break the law in the name of the law. It doesn't necessarily sound as fun and enjoyable as Abbott Elementary, but it has its place, you know.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, when you were really digging into this history, I'm sure you knew a lot of it as a history buff, but when you really took the time to dig into Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, what about them did you find most shocking, most frightening, most appealing to say, I can actually see how a series about them would play out?
It was really interesting getting into the two guys, and I've said this a couple of times. I certainly don't want anybody sympathizing with them. They are bad guys. But understanding them, or at least how they got into that situation, was fascinating. And the name of the game was desperation. They were both very desperate, but in very two different ways. Hunt was kind of this almost has-been. He had been a big CIA station chief, but he had been on the outs since the Bay of Pigs, just to get all historical with you, and basically was just anything he could do to get back in. And then you mix him with Liddy, who had failed out at the FBI, tried to run for political office. He was kind of a failure, so a kind of a never was. And again, for him, just desperate to be important, to be someone, to be famous. And you glue those two things together, the has been and the never was, and you pour on a big dose of desperation. And it was, to me, the opportunity to tell this story through those two characters. And I am going to use the word characters because they that's what they were. And so it's not only their viewpoint, but also seeing how who they were leads into the entire thing. And then also, of course, the collateral damage to their lives. And so it was just this opportunity when it came along. So yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that they are characters. And I find their differences so interesting, some of which you're laying out, but also just as they appear on screen, there's a real quiet intensity to Hunt, and there's such a kind of eccentric quality to Liddy.
I talked a lot about this with the guys, with Justin and Woody, but also, this is how I approached it. Very much, it's funny, it's Liddy is outward in and Hunt is inward out. And it's a fascinating thing because I think a lot of people who see episode one, if you will, are very like, oh my God, look at look at Justin, look at Hunt. I'm sorry, look at Liddy, look at Liddy, look at Liddy. And what's going to sneak up on them is what happens to Hunt over the course of the five as he sort of the in comes out. It's a very fascinating combination, and it's part of what makes them an interesting yin yang. They're almost as dangerous as they were. They're almost at their best when they're together, which is sort of a little bit of what the show is about. It's how they come together, but then also what takes them apart. But when they are together, they're like two halves of the same very dangerous, incompetent coin. So yeah.
You're touching on so many things I want to ask you about. One of which is the tone of the series. Obviously, there's some hilarious antics in the first episode that we've seen. This will air around the time of the second episode, so we won't spoil too much about what's to come. But I do want to ask you just about, we're going to see kind of in the midway through the series, how you tackle and film the actual Watergate complex and what goes down. I just wanted to ask you, I feel like there are so many ways that as a director, you could try to capture the events of that evening. How did you kind of land on the really stylized, we get some lovely like tracking shots, we get shots through binoculars. How did you land on some of the kind of vision that you had for capturing this moment in history? Because it's so kind of effective.
Um, well, I'll say this, and again, for me, a little bit, there was an opportunity. I'll start here, which is, I'm not going to lie, after years of Curb and Veep, where there's a little bit of I'm doing this, I'm doing this, and I love doing this, but there's a similarity, that sort of nonfiction documentary style. And going into this, when I got the job, when I started talking about what this was going to be, with no offense to that style, obviously I wanted this to be big. I wanted it to be cinematic. I wanted it to feel like a movie. I wanted it to feel like it could fit right next to, and in my mind, almost, I like to think that, like, this is happening at the same time All the President's Men is happening. Do you know what I mean? So I wanted it to fit into, I guess, some of those cinema ideas of, like, that great 70s filmmaking, like All the President's Men, like The Parallax View, like 3 Days of the Condor. So there are definitely some things that I'm stealing from all of those. And then at the same time, though, each episode has sort of different themes to them. And one of the things that jumps out in the third episode, which is the break-in, but of course, what we now know is 4 break-in attempts, is there's kind of an underlying heist movie sense to it. And I wanted to embrace that and do my version of the heist movie. And that's going to mean, a little bit of some tracking shots and POVs and moving with you, just because that, not that that is the cliche, but I do think that is the way to do that thing. And at the same time, on an overall thing, it is a very funny show, but at the same time, we're not writing jokes. We're not writing jokes the way we wrote jokes in Veep. Everything is played very straight, very matter of fact, even though it's often, you can't believe, oh my God, he's got the wrong tools, and all of those things. And so at the same time, the camera isn't going to judge. The camera is going to shoot it as if they are breaking in, as if everything is going right up until that magical moment where things aren't going right, and it kind of hits you out of nowhere, because it seemed like everything was pretty good until it didn't. And so that was some of it, just in terms of trying to capture a certain kind of feeling.
Something else you get to do on this series, which I so enjoyed, and something maybe viewers will not expect, is how much we get to see the Hunt and the Liddy's family life. Talk about how you wanted to capture that differently. Obviously, it takes a whole different type of directorial technique. And I love how kind of close and personal we get with those characters at home.
It was so important to get their lives. I mean, first of all, just on a character level, to understand them. So that's just the basics. It's also, I mentioned collateral damage before. We can all sit here and we can go, oh my God, the country doesn't trust the government. But that's a hard thing to understand. You know what I mean? Or, oh, it changed the way we think about politics in America. Again, these are very big ideas and they're true, but how do you bring that home? But what you can bring home, and I don't want to give anything too away, is you can watch a family get destroyed and go, oh my God, those are the costs. So that's number one, just on a big picture. With Hunt, we made the decision early on. I worked with a wonderful DP, Stephen Meisler, who I was lucky enough to grab him during the pandemic, right as I was watching Queen's Gambit. Grabbed him, saw Queen's Gambit, which was the DP on, and scooped him up ahead of 80 other people trying to get him, and grabbed him. And we made this decision very early on to go very handheld in the Hunt house, to give, almost, in bad cliche, almost that horror movie anxiety sense to what is going on in his life as he is barely functioning to keep his family together, to keep these kids who he is unattached from, this wife, this marriage that even on their best night at a family dinner is fraught with tension and underlying resentment. And it seemed like the handheld thing would be very much perfect there. And it was, and it created a real difference from when you're in the rest of the show. In just, again, I'm not looking for the audience to sit there and go, oh my God, it's handheld now, but for that sense of, these scenes are uncomfortable, they're claustrophobic, there's anxiety to them all. The Liddies, in a strange way, though, everything is very often, I don't want to go Wes Anderson on you, but very like set and perfect, and there is order, and it's insane order, but there's order to it all. And so the first time we meet them, they're kind of lined up very perfectly on the staircase, very Von Trapp style almost. And it was sort of interesting that like Liddy's nuts, but he's very nuts about law, about order. And so that kind of created this wonderful sort of differential that they bounce off each other. And obviously sometimes Liddy comes into the Hunt house, and so then he's part of that world, but obviously then the Hunts also visit the Liddies, and now we're in that world. And again, those were two of these sort of, to create sort of a tension, and again, the differences in who these two guys are that kind of came together through how we shot it.
Absolutely. I love all the detail you're pulling out right now on how you approach these characters differently. One final question, Dave, before I let you go, which is something you touched on earlier, which is just how dark and tragic the series gets as we kind of barrel towards the conclusion. I found it so moving and really heavy. As known predominantly for your comedy and your comedy series, how exciting was it for you to sink your teeth into an entirely different kind of emotional and affective mode for the kind of back half of this limited series?
It wasn't as different as you think. And I'm gonna say, I think sometimes because Veep was so funny, not that people ignored it, but sometimes they would forget about some of the stakes and what Selena went through and what she did and where she ended up, because we always felt we were doing tragedy in a great way. And I am a fan of what I like to do, what I like to watch. I like comedy in my tragedy, and I like tragedy in my comedy. So on the one hand, I will say it was not necessarily for me. I wasn't like, oh my God, what is this? I wasn't like, I've never done this before. But what I did love was, as you put it, the way it sneaks up on you, the way it kind of, there's an arc, there's a plan to the 5 episodes, where the first episode is by far, forgive words, the goofiest. I don't know what other word to use. You know what I mean? And as the stakes rise, and again, stakes rising is a bit of a network cliche, but so be it, I'll use it. But as the stakes rise, there is often still funny stuff, even in the face of really awful things. But that drama, that tragedy kind of comes at you like the shark underneath and kind of grabs you. And I guess that's what I was excited to sink my teeth into, to shock the audience with how dark it gets, as opposed to just the drama itself, but the way it tiptoes up behind you.
Well, that was incredibly effective. Dave Mandel, congratulations on White House Plumbers. Thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.